A rancher lay dying in the middle of nowhere. Broken bones, no water, no one around for miles. But just when hope ran out, a stranger stopped. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into a life-changing inheritance worth millions, and a story that will restore your faith in humanity. This isn't just about how she rescued a stranded rancher. It's about how that moment changed her life forever. Stay with us because what happens next will bring you to tears. Let's get started. Out in the dusty heart of New Mexico, where the wind never seems to stop whispering through the dry brush, there lived a man named Caleb Turner. He was a rancher through and through, leathery hands, sun-cracked skin, and a soul tethered to the land he called home for over 4 decades. His nearest neighbor 27 miles down a crooked dirt road. Caleb wasn't the kind of man who asked for help. He lived alone, ever since his wife passed 10 winters ago. His days were filled with tending cattle and mending fences, and his nights, quiet, just him, the coyotes, and an old transistor radio playing songs from another time. But one morning, everything changed. He rode out before dawn to check on a calving cow near the canyon ridge. The air was cold, and the frost bit deep. What Caleb didn't expect was the sudden fall, the crumbling edge beneath his boots, the sharp crack of bone, and the helpless silence that followed. Alone, injured, no phone, no way to call for help. And as the hours passed, and the desert sun climbed high, a single thought haunted him. Is this how it ends? The desert doesn't care who you are. It doesn't mourn, doesn't warn, and it sure as hell doesn't wait. Hours dragged on like days for Caleb Turner. The pain in his leg was unbearable, twisted and swollen beneath him. His canteen had burst in the fall, leaving nothing but dry hope and dust on his lips. He tried yelling at first, but even his voice betrayed him after a while. Nothing but the wind answered back, relentless and empty. Then came the cold. As night fell over the mesa, the temperature dropped like a stone. Caleb shivered uncontrollably, teeth clattering like old bones, body giving up inch by inch. He drifted in and out of consciousness, hallucinating his wife's voice, the smell of warm biscuits in their old kitchen, the gentle sway of her laugh. But none of it was real. Just fading echoes of a life that felt too far gone. But fate, fickle as it is, had other plans. Miles away, Ava Montgomery, a wildlife photographer from Colorado, had taken a wrong turn off the main road. Her GPS had cut out hours earlier, and now she was just following instinct and a rusty paper map she found tucked in her glove box. She'd been on her way to shoot wild horses near Blue Ridge, but got drawn in by a side road that curved like a question mark into the hills. Ava wasn't the kind of woman who panicked easily. She'd backpacked through Patagonia, slept alone under northern lights in Alaska, and once chased a snow leopard in Mongolia. But something about the vast loneliness of the New Mexico desert gave her pause. As the sun dipped low, she slowed her jeep near a bluff. That's when she saw it, a hat, weather-beaten and out of place, lying beside what looked like a torn fence post. Curious. She stopped and stepped out, boots crunching on brittle gravel. Then she heard it, barely a whisper, like wind brushing over broken glass. Help. She froze, listened again. There it was. She grabbed her flashlight, heart hammering, and moved towards the edge of the ridge, and that's when she saw him, a man crumpled in a ravine, his face ghostly pale, eyes fluttering open and shut like worn shutters in a storm. "Oh my God!" She breathed. Scrambling down the incline, she reached his side. "Sir, can you hear me?" Caleb blinked, barely able to focus. "You an angel," he croaked. "No," she whispered, tears already welling, "but you're gonna be okay." She assessed the situation quickly. Compound fracture, dehydration, borderline hypothermia. She wrapped him in her emergency blanket, gave him the last of her water, and propped him up gently. "I'm gonna get you out of here," she said firmly, as if her voice alone could will the desert to back off. Ava couldn't carry him on her own, not without risking further injury, but she had rope, a winch, and four-wheel drive, and more importantly, she had grit. For the next hour, she rigged a makeshift sled with her tarp and slowly pulled him up the incline with the Jeep, inch by painstaking inch, talking to him the whole way. "Don't fall asleep. Tell me your name. Tell me something about you." "Caleb," he whispered. "Had a dog named Duke. Damn fool used to steal my socks." She laughed through tears. "Sounds like a good dog." By the time she reached the nearest hospital over 40 miles away, it was nearly midnight. The ER staff rushed out when they saw the condition he was in. Ava watched as they wheeled him away, her hands trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. She could have left after that. Just another traveler passing through, chalking up the moment to divine coincidence. But something kept her there. Maybe it was the way Caleb's hand squeezed hers before they took him in, or the look in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and fragile hope. She stayed the night in the hospital waiting room, curled up in a stiff plastic chair, sipping bad coffee from a paper cup. In the days that followed, Ava visited him every afternoon. She brought books, listened to his stories, learned about his life, the ranch, the wife he lost too soon, and the land he never gave up on even when the world forgot he was out there. They laughed, cried, too. What began as a rescue became a friendship. And in that hospital room, amidst the beeping monitors and smell of antiseptic, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared solitude, of two souls who'd wandered too long without being seen. One afternoon, Caleb turned to her and said softly, "You know, Ava, if you hadn't found me, I don't think anyone would have. They'd have discovered my bones come spring. Probably thought I'd just wandered off like some old coyote." "Don't say that," she whispered, gripping his hand. "I mean it," he replied. "You didn't just save my life. You reminded me it still mattered." And in that moment, everything changed. 3 weeks passed since the rescue, and Caleb Turner was finally well enough to return home. The doctors called it a miracle. The nurses said it was stubbornness. But Caleb knew better. It was Ava. Her face, her voice, her hands holding his in the cold. That's what pulled him back. Ava, meanwhile, had returned to Colorado. She didn't stay for thanks or glory. She never wanted either. To her, it was simple. She'd done what anyone should have done. What mattered was that Caleb lived. And so, she left her number with the nurses, gave Caleb a soft smile before she drove away, and promised to keep in touch. Life moved on. She was back on assignment, hiking through forests, capturing owls in flight and deer at dawn. But even as she framed the perfect shots, her mind wandered. She wondered if Caleb was okay, if he was lonely again, if he had anyone bringing him warm soup or fixing the fence he once mentioned had always leaned west. Then, one morning on a quiet Thursday, her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Montgomery," the voice said. Formal, clipped. "This is Richard Hollis, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Caleb Turner." Ava stood still, suddenly cold, despite the Colorado sunshine. Is he okay?" "Yes," the man said quickly. "He's doing fine, recovering well, but he's asked me to speak with you regarding a personal matter. It's somewhat unusual." Her heart thudded. "I'm listening." He cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner has requested to update his estate. He would prefer to explain the details in person, but for legal reasons. I've been authorized to inform you that pending your consent, you are to be named a beneficiary in his final will." Silence. Ava blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Specifically, Miss Montgomery. He continued. Mr. Turner has instructed us to transfer partial ownership of his ranch, effective immediately. It's not a symbolic gesture. You'll receive access to land deeds, financial rights, and a stake in the livestock operation. She sat down. You must have the wrong person, she said softly. I'm not family. He insists, Hollis replied, and I'm to tell you, he sees you as the only one who didn't leave him behind. She drove back to New Mexico the next day, not out of greed or curiosity, but because she needed to look him in the eye and understand why. Because what kind of man gives away a lifetime of sweat and soil to a woman he barely knew? The old ranch looked different under the fall sun, less desolate, somehow. A few wind chimes clanged gently on the porch. Duke's old doghouse still sat by the barn, worn but proud. Caleb sat in a rocking chair, bundled in a plaid blanket, a book in his lap. When he saw her Jeep pull up, he smiled so wide it cracked the stoicism off his face like spring-thawing old ice. Took you long enough, he said. She sat beside him quietly for a moment, just letting the wind speak. Then she finally asked, Why me, Caleb? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the land rolling hills that turned gold in the late afternoon light, fences he'd hammered in himself, trees he'd planted when he and his wife first bought the place. My father always told me, don't die with your hands closed. I didn't understand what he meant, until I almost did. He turned to her, voice soft but steady. You didn't know me. You didn't owe me anything. But you saved me. Ava. Not just my life. You saved something I'd lost years ago, the belief that people still show up just because it's right. He paused, emotion trembling beneath his words. My wife and I never had children. We tried, lost 3. She was the only family I ever had. After she passed, I stopped planting flowers, stopped fixing the broken things, started sleeping with the lights off because it didn't matter anymore. He looked her dead in the eyes. Then you came along, and for some reason, that day, you chose to stop, to care. And I realized I've been hoarding all this land, this legacy, for what dust? He handed her a folded letter. It was written in his wife's handwriting, years old, yellowed with time. Ava read the words slowly. If ever someone shows you the kind of kindness the world forgot, give them more than thanks. Give them a piece of the good you've built. They've earned it. Tears welled in Ava's eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Then don't. Caleb said, just promise me you'll plant flowers again. Here, on this land. Make something grow. And in that moment, Ava understood. It wasn't just about the money, or the land, or the legalities. It was about trust, about passing on something sacred, not because of obligation, but because of connection. Because when you find someone who reminds you of your own humanity, you hold on to that, even if it means letting go of everything else. Ava Montgomery had always believed she was just passing through towns, through forests, through moments capturing slices of life with her lens, never lingering long enough to leave a footprint. That was her rhythm. That was her shield. She documented the world, but never truly belonged to any piece of it. Until now, until a dying rancher gave her half of everything he had, and in doing so, cracked open a piece of her heart she didn't know was closed. She stayed on the ranch that fall, what was now, legally, her ranch. She had intended to stay just a few days, long enough to help Caleb adjust, long enough to see what this inheritance really meant. But each time she packed her things, something small stopped her. One morning it was the smell of fresh hay and the sound of horses nickering near the gate. Another, It was Caleb calling her kiddo as he handed her coffee in a chipped mug that once belonged to his wife. Eventually, she stopped pretending she was leaving. Instead, she started walking the land, learning the rhythms of it, listening to the stories buried in the soil. But the deeper she rooted, the more restless she became inside. Because along with the acres and livestock and old red barn came something heavier than any camera she'd ever carried responsibility. Legacy. History. And guilt. That guilt crept in quietly, like morning mist over the fields. Who was she to deserve this? What right did she have to inherit a man's life's work? There were ranch hands who'd been there longer than she'd been alive. Neighbors who had brought food during storms. A niece who visited every Christmas. And yet, Caleb had chosen her. One night, she sat on the back porch steps, watching the stars blink awake above the wide New Mexico sky. Caleb shuffled out beside her, wrapped in his thick wool blanket. "You think I made a mistake, don't you?" he asked softly. She hesitated, startled. "No, I don't understand why me." He chuckled low. "You keep waiting for a reason big enough to make it okay. But Ava, life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes, the smallest acts carry the most weight." He tapped his chest. "You didn't rescue me because you wanted something. That's what made it pure. You saw a man in the dirt and thought, he matters. That's enough." Still, Ava struggled. She found herself waking early and working late, trying to prove, if only to herself, that she earned this, fixing fences, mucking stalls, cooking meals Caleb never asked for, photographing every inch of the land like she could capture its secrets before they slipped away. But the ranch wasn't asking her to prove anything. It was just asking her to stay. One evening, she was in the barn tending to an injured colt when she heard a small voice behind her. "You're the angel, right?" She turned to see a girl, maybe 7 or 8, staring at her with huge brown eyes and a dusty nose. Behind her stood an older woman, holding a tray of cornbread. "I'm sorry," the woman said kindly. "Didn't mean to intrude. We're the Vasquez family, live down the ridge. Caleb used to bring us firewood in the winters. When we heard he was back, we wanted to check in." Ava smiled, heart catching in her throat. "You're not intruding. Please, come in." That night, around the kitchen table, once cold and unused, laughter bloomed, stories spilled. The girl, Sophia, braided Ava's hair and declared her cooler than YouTubers. Ava hadn't laughed that hard in years. After they left, Caleb looked at her with a knowing grin. "You're not just inheriting dirt, Ava. You're inheriting people, their trust, their memories, their belief that this place still means something." And that's when it hit her. This wasn't just about land. It was about roots, about choosing, finally, to belong somewhere. Not because she had to, but because someone had looked at her and said, "You matter here." She walked the ranch the next morning with new eyes. Not as a visitor, but as a steward. She met with the local feed store owner, set up veterinary visits, sat down with the ranch hands and asked what they needed. She started a journal, not digital, but handwritten, where she documented every small change when the calves were born, when the wind shifted, when Caleb smiled for the first time in days. But more than that, she opened her heart. She sent photos to Caleb's old friends, printed framed portraits for his late wife's grave. And every Sunday, she brought fresh flowers, wild ones she picked from the ridge, just like Caleb's wife once did. In doing all this, she discovered something unexpected. She was healing, too. All her life, Ava had drifted, moving from story to story without letting them touch her. But this one, this dusty, hard-earned story of a lonely man and a stranger who stopped, had carved a permanent place inside her. and she was finally letting it in. The first time Ava stood at the center of Caleb's ranch and whispered, "It's mine now," it didn't feel real. It felt borrowed, like trying on someone else's coat warm, but unfamiliar. But weeks passed, then months, and slowly something shifted. The land, once a stranger, began to greet her. The trees recognized her step. The horses neighed when she passed. Even the creaking floorboards of the old farmhouse no longer protested her presence. And one morning, after mending a broken fence post under the soft orange sky, she realized she didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like a keeper. But Ava wasn't content with just maintaining Caleb's legacy. Somewhere deep inside her, maybe the part that once wandered mountains alone with nothing but a camera, she knew she was being called to do more. Because kindness that big, kindness that saves your life and hands you another, it deserves to be multiplied. So she began dreaming. And those dreams looked nothing like her old ones. Not photo galleries or international magazines, but a new purpose for the ranch, one that could outlive her. It started with a question. She was walking past the old hay barn with Caleb, who now used a cane, but insisted on joining her morning rounds when she paused and said, "Have you ever thought about what this place could be? Besides just a ranch." He raised a snowy eyebrow. "You mean like a wedding venue?" He chuckled. "No." She laughed. "I mean, something for people, something more." He didn't answer right away, just looked out across the pasture, the horses grazing peacefully in the morning haze. "You know," he said finally, "my wife used to say this land could heal people. She said it healed me when we lost the twins. That there's something about wide skies and open space that makes grief breathe easier." Ava nodded slowly. I think she was right. That night, she stayed up late, notebook in hand, writing by candlelight like her thoughts were on fire. What if the ranch became a sanctuary? Not just for animals, but for people in pain. Veterans with PTSD. Children in foster care. Women rebuilding their lives after abuse. People like her, wandering, lost, trying to remember who they were before the world made them forget. She researched late into the night, called nonprofits, watched documentaries, took notes from trauma counselors and equine therapy experts. And slowly, the idea crystallized. The Wildflower Project. A place where broken people came to remember they could bloom again. Where land wasn't just soil, it was soul. Where a legacy wasn't measured in acres, but in hearts mended. The first call she made was to Sophia's mother, Mrs. Vasquez. "I'm thinking of offering weekend programs," Ava explained nervously. "Horse care, gardening, art, just a safe space. Would you bring Sophia?" Mrs. Vasquez got quiet, then said, "Ava, my daughter hasn't stopped talking about you since the day we came by. She's drawn your picture on every notebook she owns. Of course we'll come." That was all the permission she needed. Within a month, Ava transformed the old tool shed into a classroom, hung art supplies on the walls, cleared the barn loft to create a cozy reading nook with pillows and bean bags and fairy lights strung along the beams. She reached out to schools, churches, women's shelters. At first, only a few came. A boy who wouldn't speak but brushed the horses for hours in silence. A teen girl who sat alone, sketching wildflowers she'd never seen before. A single mother who cried when Ava gave her tomatoes from the garden, whispering it was the first time in weeks she'd cooked a real meal. And Caleb. He watched it all quietly, sometimes from his porch, sometimes sitting right in the middle of it all offering advice on fencing or telling old cowboy jokes to kids who'd never seen a horse up close. "Your wife would have loved this," Ava told him one day. He nodded, eyes wet. "She's in it, every bit of it." "Ah!" But then came the reporter. A local journalist caught wind of the project and asked to visit. At first, Ava hesitated. This was never meant to be about attention. But the kids deserved to be seen. Their courage deserved a spotlight. So, she agreed. The article was published under the headline, "She rescued a rancher. Now she's rescuing the community." And suddenly, the calls came. Donations. Volunteers. Requests from therapists offering free sessions. Even a foundation that pledged to help build cabins for long-term stays. Ava stood on the hill overlooking the ranch one evening, phone buzzing in her pocket, and felt something break open inside her. Not fear, not overwhelm, but hope. Hope that this land, which had almost taken a man's life, was now saving dozens more. Caleb came up beside her, leaning on his cane. "You turned a debt into a mission," he said softly. She shook her head. There was never a debt, only a gift. They stood in silence, watching kids in the pasture laughing with the horses, volunteers hammering planks for the new garden beds, and butterflies dancing between wildflowers. Ava smiled. "This isn't just a ranch anymore." "Caleb?" "No," he agreed. "It's a beginning." Winter came early that year. The first frost laid a silver coat over the pastures, and the wind whispered through the bare cottonwoods like a voice from the past. The children still came, bundled in coats too big, laughing with red cheeks as they fed the horses or pressed their hands into fresh snow. Ava watched them from the porch with quiet awe. The ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. And yet behind the laughter, behind the new gardens and the cabins being raised, a shadow loomed. Caleb had grown slower. His steps faltered more. He coughed in the mornings, deeper now, like something inside him was unraveling. Ava tried not to see it at first. She brewed his tea stronger, insisted he rest more. But she saw how long it took him to get up from his chair, how he stared off at the hills longer than usual, like memorizing something he knew he'd soon forget. Then one night, he didn't come down for dinner. She found him in bed, weak and pale, the old wool blanket tucked to his chin. "Just tired," he whispered. "That's all." But she knew better. The doctor came the next day. Stage 4, too far gone, lungs like brittle paper. No treatment would change the ending now. Ava sat in silence as the doctor left. The walls of the house felt too close, the wind too loud. Her hands trembled as she lit the fireplace. Not from cold, but fear. She didn't know how to say goodbye to the man who gave her a life she didn't know she needed. That night, she sat by his bed and tried to be strong. But Caleb wasn't interested in quiet sadness. "You know what I regret," he rasped, eyes twinkling. She shook her head. "Not planting more pecan trees. Damn things always die on me. Guess they don't like my attitude." She laughed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're impossible." He reached out and touched her hand. "No, kiddo. I'm grateful. That's what I am." Silence sat heavy between them for a moment. Then he whispered, "You know, when I was lying in that ravine, I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid no one would remember I lived." Her heart cracked. "You changed that," he said. "You gave me a second ending, a better one." Ava leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder, careful not to hurt him. "You gave me a beginning." In the final week, the ranch became quieter. Children still came, but they kept their voices soft near the house. The horses sensed it, two gathering closer to the fence near Caleb's window, as if standing vigil. Ava didn't leave his side. She read him his wife's letters, played old country music on the radio, told him everything she saw out on the land, the hawks nesting, the frost lifting, the first sprout of the winter carrots. And then, one dawn, while the sky was still wrapped in shades of lavender, Caleb slipped away, holding her hand. There were no last words. Just peace, like the land itself had exhaled with him. The funeral was held on the ranch. Not in a church, not in silence. It was loud with children's voices and horses snorting and neighbors telling stories around a bonfire. Just how Caleb would have wanted. Ava stood under the big cottonwood tree and read from his wife's journal. What we leave behind isn't in the things we own, but in the hearts we've loved, in the lives we've touched without even trying. Then she did something no one expected. She opened a small tin box Caleb had kept in his nightstand. Inside were dozens of photos, her photos, from her first days on the ranch, her first smile after the rescue, pictures of her with the kids, Caleb with Duke, flowers in bloom, fences being built, tears and laughter, frozen in frames. He had printed every single one, as if documenting her journey was his final project. That day, she pinned every photo along the barn walls. It became a memorial, a gallery not of his life alone, but of what they built together. People cried. So did Ava. But for the first time, it wasn't from grief alone. It was gratitude. Spring arrived early that year, and with it, something new. Ava announced she would open the ranch full-time, not just weekends. Scholarships would be offered to kids in need. Veterans could live on-site during treatment. Therapists would rotate in monthly. A nearby community college partnered to offer equine therapy certification for young students. But the biggest change, she renamed the ranch. From Turner Ranch to Second Wind. Because, as she told the crowd at the dedication, that's what this place gave Caleb, what he gave me, and what I hope we can give to everyone who steps through these gates. The new sign was carved from old wood, hand-painted by one of the girls from the after-school group. It hung proudly over the main gate, where sunflowers now bloomed every spring. And on a bench nearby, beneath a pecan tree she planted herself, sat a bronze plaque that read, "For Caleb Turner, who died remembered." The wind still whispered through the fields at Second Wind Ranch, but it no longer sounded empty. It sang now. It sang through the laughter of children running barefoot in the tall grass, through the hammering of volunteers raising new cabins in spring sunlight, through the hum of Ava's voice as she read bedtime stories to teenagers who hadn't heard one in years. The land had changed, and so had she. No longer the wanderer chasing moments behind a lens. Ava was now the one building them, crafting moments that would outlast her, just as Caleb had done. The woman who once fled from connection now ran straight into its fire. It had been nearly a year since Caleb passed. A year since that cold dawn where she held his hand and felt the last heartbeat of the man who gave her everything. And yet, he was everywhere. In the way she brewed coffee exactly how he liked it, 2 sugars. No cream. In the porch chair, she still couldn't bring herself to move. In the quiet hush just before dusk, when the sky turned that exact shade of blue he used to say, reminded him of his wife's eyes. And most of all, in the way the ranch thrived, not just physically, but spiritually. Ava had made good on every promise. She had expanded the programs, secured a grant from a national mental health foundation, and partnered with local schools and hospitals. Second Wind became a sanctuary not just for trauma survivors, but for anyone lost between chapters of their life. It welcomed veterans haunted by silence, runaways with nothing but a duffel bag and broken trust, burned-out teachers, widows, former inmates, forgotten souls. They came afraid, hesitant, uncertain, but they stayed, because this wasn't a place that asked who you had been. It asked, "Who do you want to become now?" And Ava had an answer for each of them. One night, she sat with a young woman named Lila a runaway who hadn't spoken in 2 weeks. They watched the horses graze under a crescent moon. Ava gently placed her hand over Lila's and whispered, "You don't have to tell me what happened. Just let this land carry it with you." Lila finally cried. And then, finally, she spoke. That moment, just like the moment Caleb once whispered, "Is this how it ends in the dust?" became a turning point. Ava realized she hadn't inherited a ranch. She'd inherited a bridge. From pain to peace, from isolation to belonging, from silence to song. The local news came back, then national outlets. Soon, Second Wind was featured in a human interest documentary titled The Ranch That Healed 100 Hearts. It aired one Sunday night and went viral. Ava received hundreds of letters. One from a woman in Minnesota who wrote, "I've never met you, but you helped me believe there's still good in this world." Another from a young man who simply wrote, "You saved me. I was going to give up. Then I saw your story. I'm still here." Ava cried reading them. Not from pride, but from disbelief that something born from one quiet act of decency could ripple so far. Caleb had once said, "Don't die with your hands closed." She finally understood. Because every open hand, every gesture, every kindness echoed. And in those echoes lived redemption, rebirth, renewal. On the first anniversary of Caleb's passing, Ava organized a remembrance event. People from all over came. Kids now grown, veterans now stable, mothers who had found themselves again. Each person planted a wildflower on the ridge. As Ava stood in front of the crowd, holding the same hat Caleb had worn the day she found him, she spoke with tears in her eyes and strength in her voice. "A year ago, I was a stranger driving a lonely road. I stopped for a man I didn't know. I thought I saved him. But what I didn't realize is that he saved me, too. Caleb gave me this land, but what he really gave me was a second chance. And all I've ever tried to do is pass that chance forward." She paused, swallowing hard. "So if you're here today and you feel broken, if life has knocked the wind out of you, if you're carrying something no one else sees, just know this ranch stands for you. You still have a story. You still have a second wind." And as the sun dipped low over the horizon, the crowd stood in silence. Then slowly, they clapped, one by one, until the sound of applause filled the fields, until even the wind stood still. And somewhere, in that sacred moment, Ava swore she felt Caleb's presence beside her, hand on her shoulder. Silent and proud. One life saved, hundreds changed. It all began with a choice. Not a grand gesture, not a heroic act. Just a woman, stopping her car, walking into the dust, and saying, "I'm here. I see you." And from that, a miracle grew. We often think that changing a life requires power, money, or fame. But this story reminds us it doesn't. All it takes is presence, a moment of seeing someone, of choosing to stop instead of drive past, of saying, "You matter, even when the world says otherwise." Ava didn't set out to be a hero. She wasn't searching for meaning. But her heart was open, and in that space, a miracle happened. Not because she had to, but because she chose to care. And Caleb, he taught us that legacy isn't about land or wealth. It's about what we do with our second chances. He gave away everything he built, not because he was dying, but because someone helped him feel alive again. In the end, the greatest inheritance wasn't the ranch. It was the belief in humanity reborn between two strangers. This story is about how one small act of kindness can echo for generations. Because when you give someone hope, you don't just save their life, you change the world. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of real-world kindness and redemption. Click to continue the journey, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe every life is worth saving.